Okay, so I told him this after we recruited him to do this job, and I said, you have the hardest job of the day, Pat. Your job is to try to capture the rich bits of the conversation and the rich bits of the presentation today, and it certainly covered a broad range of things and a broad range of ideas. So Pat is going to do his best. Pat, by the way, is one of our major ethics professors here at Notre Dame, and he's a professor in the marketing department and has specialized his research specifically on issues in marketing, ethics in marketing. But he's a broad-ranging thinker and a very good professor, and I'm looking forward to Pat. You're pulling this all together.
And I am a professor that knows when it's time to shut up. So you will not, I won't be the last person in the room, at least I hope. So as a professor, I can't resist giving you a citation to a book that's done by our sociologist colleague here at Notre Dame. His name's Christian Smith, who studied adolescent behavior. It's called Lost in Transition. He's done a number of depth interviews, but the first chapter here on morality adrift is why I would argue those 10% are not, that you say are the young people in your businesses who are not talking to anybody else, because the USA Today version of chapter 1 is I'm okay, you're okay when it comes to morality. To say it's a gray world is giving them benefit of the doubt. But I think as you're training new employees and looking at people coming out of college, it's definitely worth looking at. And I've read that chapter. I haven't read the rest of the book, but it's definitely worth knowing about. So that's the new, when Mary was talking, I can't resist the old and the really old. The practice point is Aristotelian, and I have a quote. This was my first book, or second book, I guess, my colleague from Marquette, Ethical Marketing Decisions. People said, well, it must be a short book. But Exhibit 2-6 on the importance of habit in cultivating virtue. And this is a letter to the editor, paraphrasing Fulton Sheen, who some of you may be old enough in the room to know, in the late 80s. Your intellect is the seat of knowledge, your will the seat of virtue. Your intellect sets up targets, your will shoots the arrows of your choices and acts. Ethics can be taught, but ethical conduct cannot. It must be practiced. All the theoretical knowledge in the world about music will not make you a good pianist, or somebody talked about earlier, a good free throw shooter, unless you practice. All the theoretical knowledge in the world about ethics will not make you a virtuous manager unless you practice. So I'm just kind of ending the note where the day where Mary started on the importance of practice, which I think does have a theoretical standpoint or background. And Mary's too humble to tell you about the book that she did about the time our book came out in, I think, the late 80s or early 90s. Can ethics be taught? Well, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't think that was the case. But it's been, depressing and exhilarating depending on how long you've studied it and where you come from. And I want to apologize because I had to go out and teach my own class from 10 to noon today. So I don't know anything about Jamie, and I feel like I've been robbed. So somebody's going to have to fill me in on that. But just kind of 2 summary points and maybe 3 other points, since I've taught ethics for a long time. And besides marketing ethics, I've looked at corporate ethics for so long. My hair was a different color when I started. So I have a few of my things I'd like to share with you. To me, the kind of overriding couple themes, is the diversity of approaches. We started with pedagogy, and you had Mary standing up here, and I wish I could hold a room as long as you can, Mary, without having overheads. And we had videos and simulations and processes and different approaches. And Also, I know that there was a number of small group discussions within your tables, so that I think the takeaway for me in that is, let 1,000 flowers bloom. What works for one person may not work for another. What works for one organization may not work for another. But if you haven't tried some of these things, including Twitter, which I haven't tried, or other things, I think it bears looking into and talking to your employees and people within your organizations that, we all know learning is two-way, and I think today is a good example of the importance of not just two-way, multiple-way learning. To me, another major takeaway that the last presentation did an excellent job of saying, look at all the disciplines we draw from if we're trying to teach ethics or discuss ethics within any kind of organization, whether it's classroom, the corporate area, or other contexts. And the list is far too long, but philosophy. Today I happen to be I teach a course in sustainability in business, and the textbook authors are really all about it makes good business sense. So we had a discussion today on ethical underpinnings and Catholic social thought, and the range of speaking of emotions, a range of emotions in the room, where some was, yeah, very good, or yeah, we got to humor this professor for an hour here and talk about that. But I think that's what we need in this whole area of ethics, whether it's in the classroom or elsewhere, of being cognizant of neuroscience as well as philosophy, theology, social psychology, sociology, the study of groups, organization behavior. The list is almost endless, but I think the point is to be open and realize that there are many different contexts, and the more we know, probably the more we don't know, but to realize, and I think today has been a very good appreciation for the multidisciplinarity, if that's the proper word, for ethics itself. And while you're thinking of what your takeaways are for the day, let me share with you a couple things that I feel about corporate ethics training based on experience, based on teaching students for more years than I'd like to admit, and seeing some of the trends in ethics training. And the one that I'm probably putting myself out there, but is that if all your training on ethics is online training, I would ask you to think about it. I realize that many of your organizations, certainly Deloitte and others, have thousands of employees, and it's not feasible or possible to get everybody in a room with 30 people on a regular basis. But what I've argued for years is that in sales meetings and meetings that you have, that are staff meetings that still, I think, exist, and the one with the multiple videos and the conference call, yeah, I think we're probably moving in that direction. But we still have some meetings when people are in the room, and not being afraid to have your line managers raise difficult ethical issues. And one concept that I don't think has been talked about today that I'd like to share with you and be happy to discuss it at another time with you is the notion of an ethical audit. And what are those most frequently asked questions that really keep people up at night? And they would be different for the sales department than they would be for the HR department, and different areas, but it may be a way to incorporate some of these interpersonal dimensions into ethics, realizing that yes, you've got objectives, you've got to train your employees and all that, but kind of to think a bit more broadly about the notion, and I know that probably I'm speaking to the converted in this room. It's the colleagues from other companies who basically say, check the box is what it's all about. But I think that we need to, as going forward, we have many social media and other options, but I resonated with what Joe Holt said this morning, is that if you, in our case discussions in our classroom, if you allow students to speak, other students would say, wow, I didn't really think about that, or I didn't know where this person was coming from. And to the extent you can allow people that opportunity, I would encourage you. One other, and this isn't a sales pitch, but one other thing about Notre Dame, and Jessica, I'm sure, talked to you about our multiplicity of undergrad classes, but to Ed Conlon's credit as Associate Dean, we moved from a semester system to a modular system, what, Ed, 5, 6 years ago? About 6 years ago, and at that time we had a 3-credit required business ethics course, and we had that since the institution of our MBA program. But what Ed and we decided is we went from 3 to actually 4 credits. So Joe shared with you the first course, but my sustainability in business class qualifies as a second ethics course, marketing ethics, international business ethics, finance. I think we have a menu of about 10 different courses that students can gravitate to in that second course, and some even take more than that. So that we're trying to come at it from a number of different dimensions here at Notre Dame, and as all of you are, we're learning as we go. So I'm going to stop there and just ask those of you that had the good fortune to be here from wire to wire to comment on other things that maybe your, as we call them in the current vernacular, takeaways or points that you'd like to share with people before we adjourn here. So I say to my students, who's going to be first?
Well, going back to the previous lecture here, just the insights around the emotions and the drawing upon experiences, and that even if you're doing experiential learning, which we hang our hat on, it's really not the experience we're creating in the moment, but you're actually drawing and bringing the baggage and everything of their entire life forward. And I think that gave me a little bit of personal pause to go, okay, are we doing this in the best way possible? Or are there things that we can tweak and can harness those previous experiences? So some huge insights came out from today. There's some aha moments for me.
Yes. And that emotion, to me, is very much akin to engagement. If you can get people emotionally involved, they're going to be more engaged. They're probably going to learn more, take more away. And I like your term, Chris, of elevation. That really what we're trying to do, whether we're in the undergrad, MBA classroom, or your training programs, is elevate and voice the values, elevate not just the discussion, but elevate the behavior, and trying to have a more ethical workplace out there for sure, and classroom environment and so on. So, good point.
You know, the comment that was made about empathy is easier to teach than ethics, and the connect as sort of almost a little bit of a window on that journey. I thought it was interesting, particularly for us, because we are focusing now on empathy as it relates to serving clients, and but haven't made as much that connection to empathy as it relates to ethics. A little bit, and maybe more than I realized, but it sounds like the connection there is there's an opportunity there.
Yes. One of my favorite descriptors of empathy is a Native American slogan or comment, you never know a person till you walk a mile in their moccasins. So literally putting yourselves in the position of others, and I've done a little writing on virtue ethics in marketing, and empathy was one of the areas that I emphasize. And it's not the same, the philosophers obviously, but it's not the same as sympathy. Being empathetic is not, you might be sympathetic as well. I have to be careful. My colleague Robert Audi's in the back there will be calling me on this. But the empathy point, extremely important.
Yeah, what just really reinforced for me is that this is all part of the human condition. I think that, we can become buried in business, because the comment was made earlier, I think, that somebody was really put off by comparison of a master's in public administration versus business administration. You go to public if you really want to make a difference. You go to business to make money. And I think the idea is that business is a human endeavor, and that we really, ethics and everything is about leadership, so we really have to humanize leadership and this personalization. And that's where this really hit home the empathy, the elevation. I just think that we talk a lot about who the audience is and the millennials and what we have to change them, but I think that it's putting the mirror up to ourselves is the change starts at the top, and that's what it's done.
That's right. It's much easier for organizations if the top is setting the right example, for sure.
Yeah, I've long said each of us not only has our stories, but we are our stories. And when we tell our stories, my experience is other people hear their stories too. And that all the stories are the same. And to get back to it, it's about the human condition. And so if we can speak out of that emotional frame of reference, out of our personal experiences, I think real leadership emerges when we do that introspection. And when we do that, we can connect better to the world. We can relate better to other people because we've done our own work.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, something that hit me was a very subtle line, and I think in the late one where we talked about ethics is no longer standalone as the goal. And I think sometimes the orthodoxies we have is that it's a course, it's a script, it's a tool, it's something that's not pervasive. So maybe a thought-provoking thought process here is where what would happen if we actually deaggregated, not actually add, but actually deaggregated ethics into the rest of the curriculum and then actually summarized it in the course. So maybe as an example, how would you actually create tool sets to actually apply it in real life to make it personal for each of the classes and then actually aggregate it later and say, we've actually been teaching you ethics in all the courses up until this point, and then how does it aggregate and actually relate it back? Tracking, I know, is almost impossible, but how do we actually drive that in? I think having engineering tasks and innovation, inventors. I think the interesting thing about semantics and lexicons, the interesting part about writing a patent is that you get to write your own lexicon. You can make your own words. You can make blue, green, black. It's just how you define it. So, but you have to make it applicable to those skilled in the art. And so if we don't teach the skilled in the art in everything we do, we keep it separate, and we can add probably 10 more classes probably. But how do we actually integrate it? I think that was a theme a lot of people talked about. How does it get more integrated into all the aspects, whether it be emotion, cognitive, rational, even regret or whatnot? How do we actually understand the motivational factors at all the levels? And to me, the end goal would be beautiful if we could say it's not actually the course we have to teach, but actually an outcome of the courses that we did.
Well, the debate in academia for a long time is, do you have a standalone ethics course or do you integrate ethics into the curriculum? And our argument here at Notre Dame is both and. Both the standalone course and integrating, and the same way in your corporations. We had a corporate speaker last fall in our ethics lecture series that said something that sounds trite, but to a group like this, I think it's worth relaying. He said, ethics is both how you act and how you react. And think of the 21st century and all the pressures you have and the bloggers and other people kind of coming at you. You don't know where they're literally coming from, but to me, trying to put in place contingency plans or looking at other disciplines and say, how can we be prepared for that, blindside, middle of the night call or other things that might occur.
Historically, where students might years ago have gone to Roger's class in finance, big M&A case, and the student raises his hand and says, "Professor, but isn't there an ethical issue there?" And he'd say, "No, that's Dr. Murphy's course." Well, we have that in business today too, don't we? You go to the CEO during a merger acquisition and say, "I think there's some ethical issues here," and he says, "Go see Mike Zazinski. He's on the 3rd floor. He's the ethics officer." Don't talk to me. How do you integrate it? How do you make it part of the fabric, the essence of everything that we are as individuals and that we can be as organizational?
Right on. Andrew, student speaker.
Well, I am coming at this from a student's perspective, and Dean Conlon referenced earlier that students will go in and why am I taking this class? And I think I've heard heard that from classmates too. They don't necessarily see the relevance of this in what it is that they're attempting to do in their careers. And let me just take my finance classes or marketing classes, and that's the job that I want, and those are the skills that I need. So I think to the extent that it could be, the relevance could be shown, and I think part of that is companies signaling that that's a skill that you're looking for in your recruiting process as well. You know, that's something that's integrated into we're not just assessing problem-solving skills. You know, we're not just assessing behavioral. I know that it comes out in some of the behavioral, but the ethical piece, like how do you assess that, and how do you send a signal to students that that is something that you take seriously? I know one of the things that I thought was really cool in applying to Notre Dame, it was the only school that I saw this, was that I had to do a character assessment, and I had to go through something that, you know, obviously there were people who were going to game any system, but I had to go through an assessment of, you know, how would I handle this situation. I thought that was really interesting. That to me, it sent the signal that Notre Dame was really serious about having ethical students part of the program, and that that's something they take seriously. So how do we send that signal to students and to employees that that's something that they're being assessed on, and that's something that is an expectation, and it's part of a skill set that you would expect them to have?
Yes, on both sides, and Adam and I are working on a revision of something that I did about 5 or 6 years ago. I was involved with the Ethics Resource Center, which I assume most of you know about. And one of the topics came up at an ERC meeting was that people who were hiring, you know, new employees were not asking any questions about ethics. So with the help of Linda Trevino and a few other people, we had this, it's a back-to-back flyer, maybe some of you have even seen it, about questions that both sides can ask each other to surface some of these issues kind of from the front end. So we'll be happy to, we get that revised to send it out to you for sure. Gretchen, do you have a?
Well, it occurs to me that there are a lot of decision-making models, and we heard a number of them referenced here today, but I think we've also heard that you can have any kind of decision-making model that you want, but the very last step really needs to be, what will you do? And then go do it. So the action piece of what we've been talking about, it seems to me, is something that, as we look at the different decision-making models that we use in our corporations or in our classes, let's make sure that there's an action piece that's in every one of those. Otherwise, it's just a passive exercise that doesn't require anybody to really understand that taking that next step to implement your decision is really the most meaningful step of all.
Seeing Ed Cohen here, it's been a number of years ago. Ed was writing then for the Notre Dame magazine, and we're rolling out, I think, our new undergrad required ethics course, and the comment that I said to Ed, Gretchen, is we can give students the background, but can we give them the backbone to, you know, and I think that's when we need to keep working on that and keep that top of mind. Mary?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Gretchen said and what Ron, right, what you were saying earlier. And one of the things that I've certainly found over the years in terms of this idea about, you know, integrating across the courses is that faculty, in good faith and with the best of intentions, to say, you know, of course I want my students to be ethical and responsible business people, but I'm an expert training. You know, I didn't study philosophy, I didn't study ethics. How can I teach that? Plus, my curriculum is really full as it is. I'm teaching a set of skills, and I do that in every field. And so, one of the things that we were hoping to be helpful with the kinds of case methodology that we were developing at GCD is that it skips over that piece by having a case that sort of ends with an answer, right? Then if it's an accounting case, it's about cooking the books. Then you're, as an accounting faculty member, I don't have to preach to my students, don't cook the books. I don't have to pretend they won't be pressured to cook the books because they like to be. But what I can do is actually say, we just taught you all of this stuff about what the rules are, what the consequences of doing this can be, how you could design a system that would make it harder to build, how you could detect it, you know, how you can create segments. Now I want you to go create, using the language and the tools of accounting, create a response to how you deal with this. And so what we found is that we're getting a good response from faculty who don't want to teach ethics, but who are perfectly happy to have students apply the skills they're teaching to how you get this done in your organization. And I think it sort of brings together your 2 points.
The end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Rubber meets the road. And
Chris just left, but one of the things that really resonated with me is he went back to bringing up an old equation from Kurt Levine, who was the kind of the father of the modern industrial psychology. And it's a simple equation, and it's that behavior equals a function of the person times the environment. And his model was pretty complex, but at the simplest level, what resonated to me about his statement was that if you're trying to solve the problem, or address the problem, how you reduce the chance that people will do things that are against values, and increase the chance that they will do things that are consistent with values that you want to promote, you probably just can't focus on P alone. And unfortunately, I think a lot of ethics training maybe overweights the focus on the individual without asking the question, what is it about the situation in which that person operates that makes it harder or easier for that individual to do what you would want them to do? I mean, how often have you heard, well, I got into it because everybody does it? Or my favorite Wall Street statement, we had to be in it. Okay, no, you didn't have to be in it, you chose to be in it, right? And the reason why you're saying you had to be in it is because there's something about, there was an influence factor going on there that's very important. So I don't think you can tackle the problem without looking at both P and E. And that was an important reminder for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to expand on that, I heard it from several people, the culture, or a term that I like to talk about, corporate character. You know, is there such a thing? We talk a lot about culture, but I think what many of us are driving at is, you know, can we get to that point where there's a corporate character that's so ingrained that we know with the environment without having to ask people or go through a training program or whatever. Other thoughts, comments? Keith?
About 6 years ago at one of our conferences where the question was posed, does man corrupt the system or does the system corrupt man? Prosecuting the corporation was Andrew Wiseman, the former head of the Enron task force, and prosecuting men was Gary Brown, who investigated Enron for the Senate. And we called witnesses, and I won't bore you with all the details, it's fascinating, but the vote, we were the jury, yes, in the audience, and the vote came out 50-50.
So there you go. Hung jury, huh? Robert.
Let me make a suggestion about teaching all the way through, and this applies to corporate life as well. I think we're role models as teachers or managers. Maybe everybody's a role model to someone. And role modeling is extremely important. And it seems to me that we would all comment on a bad business decision. That was stupid, that lost money. Not everybody would comment on an ethically shady decision that made money. So it seems to me intuition comes in here, stories come in, hypotheticals come in, and what we laugh at and what we admire creeps through whether we say anything or not. So I think we have to address ethics day in and day out where it's relevant to decisions, which it often is. And the role modeling does a great deal. But I still agree with the Notre Dame idea that you have to teach it explicitly as well as role modeling.
There was an interesting bracketing that occurred to me. I don't know if anybody else can really pick up on. You kind of started off the day talking about MBA students coming in complaining, why do we have to take these ethics courses? You know, they're not helping me.
And not just unique to ethics courses. Yeah, that's one of them.
Don't pick on us.
Yeah. Sometimes it's econ.
Right. So they're not seeing the value. They're a few years out in business careers, I would imagine in most cases. And then we heard from our student, whose name I'm sorry, I don't know. Andrea, who's saying that, I don't know if you're speaking personally, or you're certainly hearing from other students, they don't see the value in ethics courses either. They're wondering, how is this going to get me my job when I get out here? I have to go make money and pay off my student loans and all this. So it sounds like students don't appreciate, they don't see the value in ethics courses. And I wonder if it raises the question of, you have to be further along your career when you've been in more of these situations and wondered what to do. And wondered about, you know, where do you draw the line between being a tough business person, a shrewd business person, and having to keep up with the Joneses, being in it, as you said, Wall Street, being in perhaps, an industry or marketing instrument that, is not really being upfront with your customers' minds or whatever like that. So I just wonder from the standpoint of pedagogy, so we talked about can we teach ethics and what's the most effective way to teach ethics, but I wonder about the timing of it. If we're hearing MBA students and undergraduate students saying, at this point in their lives, they're not seeing the value.
Well,
Can I interject just real quickly? Those who need to be in that 4 o'clock cab, it's 4 o'clock, the cab is here, so if you want to slip out, we don't have to cut everything short, because I think there's still people who want to talk.
And we can continue the discussion. Before people leave, I have a feeling there's going to be a rush out the door right now. There's one more thing I have to do. The guy who's standing right over there, this conference would not have been what it was without him. We'll talk later too.
Now you can leave.
Yeah. Okay.
So Ed, as a person who's taught ethics for a lot of years, the kind of shorthand comment that I make is that there's a lot less cynicism post-Enron, because I think people, and Mary, I'd be interested in your view on this, people found there's a real financial cost to many stakeholders with the kind of stuff that was going on long before, the current financial crisis, but others. But I found that it wasn't as hard to sell, if you will, after that point of view, where people were linking the unethical, the slippery slope, if you will, the unethical with the illegal, with the losing millions of dollars kind of scenario. But I think it's incumbent on us as instructors, but I hear, frankly, from students, both MBAs and undergrads, that I come to Notre Dame because I know we're going to talk about these things, and I'm sure there's probably a not-so-silent minority out there who may have disagreement or kind of the squeaky wheel, but I think that the students of this era, I'd like to give them credit for realizing this is part of their day-to-day business, and at least the MBAs have had, I think, more than a few instances where they've come face-to-face with some ethical issue. Mary, do you want to comment more?
Yeah, I wonder if Andrea had something to say to that, speaking as all students.
I mean, for me, ethics is definitely an area of interest, and so I'm here. But I do think that there is, as you said, this silent minority or this vocal minority that would have stronger opinions about why it's not relevant to them. But I think to the extent that, Mary, your point about talking about action, talking about how you are actually going to use the things that you're learning in an ethics class and how it relates to how you would be a business leader. And I'm personally struggling with this as the president of Net Impact. I'm just starting as president, and that's one of the things that I really am focused on showing people is this is how this is relevant to what you're doing in marketing or what you're doing in finance, or what you're doing in investments. This is something that's relevant to the type of business leader that you should aspire to be, right? That relates business to having an impact on society, right? So it's something that, the ethics piece of it definitely, but even that, in that impact, I feel the challenge to how do I communicate the relevance of this, and how do I inspire people to really connect with this and take it into what type of business leader they're going to be when they go on to a career post-MBA. So I think, that was my point about how can companies signal to students and to employees that it's something that is important in their assessment of how they are as an employee or how they are as a student. And I was talking to someone recently about, you remember when you were a little kid and you got report cards, and part of what you were graded on as a child was your character. Did you come to school on time? Were you respectful? And it's not really there anymore. So how do we send that message that those things are important all the way from when you're talking about kids all the way up through MBAs? And I think it it is something that becomes more relevant as you have more work experience. You know, I actually worked for 5 years for Deloitte, actually, before coming back to get my MBA. And I think that you do come at it with a different perspective as an MBA student than perhaps you would as an undergrad. But I think that it's still important to send that signal that it is relevant, and here is how, and here is the action that you may find yourself encountered with, or maybe you have encountered it in the few years after undergrad that you do work. So I think that there is definitely there's definitely relevance to studying ethics as an MBA student. And just the pushback maybe more comes from the theory, from the really high level theoretical side of it, and less, you know, show me the action side of it. I think that people definitely can connect more with, oh, this case study or that piece of it, or, you know, what you're doing with giving most value. It's just how are we building a framework and shaping that muscle memory that you can then use if you find yourself in that situation. So I mean, I definitely think it's relevant.
Thank you. Gretchen, and then you.
Just a little follow-up on this. We started teaching a required course for incoming freshmen, all 650 of them, at the University of Illinois College of Business about 4 years ago. And what's happened to the undergraduate student culture is really quite interesting to me, and it was completely unexpected. What we're seeing is that students are taking these concepts from the course and incorporating them into their fraternity and sorority selection processes. They're asking questions, as examples of your exercise of professional responsibility as a student. When they're interviewing for executives of their committees, they pose the kinds of questions and challenges that would present dilemmas in their own experiences, and they make choices based on how well or how poorly people exercise professional responsibility in those situations. But I do think students take these ideas, at least in some cases, and will actually apply them in their own lives. And my fervent hope and belief is that once they have that experience in their own settings, right, it becomes normal. It is the professional responsibility muscle. You're exercising that muscle, you're building muscle memory, and you're going to walk right into your employer knowing how to do these things. And you're not going to think twice about raising these issues in a constructive and reasonable way. So I'm hopeful.
Mike, and then you.
Yeah, this is kind of going to the, a little bit, to kind of wrap up here, where we go forward with this.
Right.
You know, Jim and I have kind of talked about this. This has been fantastic, by the way. It really has. It's exceeded my expectations. But to think about the role of a center like this in terms of influencing thought and dialogue that goes more vital, right, beyond just this room. And even thinking more about the role of academia and what you're teaching. There's been more discussion lately about this notion of the end of growth. You know, go back to when you look at what the period we've come through, we're actually still in it, right, with business and governments and societies really built on this somewhat a house of cards of perpetual growth, and how that drives thinking and behavior. And so everybody's swept into that. It becomes to be, we've got to be in the game or whatever, and once everybody's doing it, the emperor's naked, but nobody wants to call it out because then the gig's out. And I'm just wondering, going back to what Ed was saying, with all the focus on the P of the person, we talked about environment. I think that's it, is reframing the dialogue on expectations going forward. Because I think if people can feel like they're in an environment where the expectations have changed, and it's not an expectation of mediocrity by any means. We need innovation, we need change, but what the outcome is supposed to be, which is really this notion of the greater good versus this drug of growth. And I just think that there's something in that dialogue that's got to be the underpinning of who's going to really help define that environment going forward. I think it is this.
No, and I love what you're saying, because I think there's an imbalance, and I come from the psychology, neuropsychology background. Way too much on the I, in the self, and the identity is the, when neuroscience blows that out of the water, it's this environment, behavioral economics, doing the same thing. And I think that we need to kind of be bold and courageous to flip things around and have courses called the threat of ethics. You know, to get to the point where you literally go 2-3 standard deviations out, not because you necessarily believe that, but you got to balance it first so people feel safe to say something. that wow, and you can get to the place where you actually understand that even coming into a place having a dialogue like this, everybody's amygdala is firing, you know, and then there's a threat to it in a way, and so I think we got to normalize that other side of the equation. To be okay to even say that, knowing that if you do that, then people will more naturally lead to a hopefully more choice. Yeah.
But I actually think, and I know where you're coming from, I understand. But I actually think in my experience in MBA level, anyway, it's just the reverse. It's much more effective to be saying, we're going to do, I mean, maybe not at Notre Dame, but it's much, I've come out of, being at places like Columbia, UCLA, and Harvard, and, we're being the person in the classroom who says, except if you're in your ethics class, and even there, who says, maybe we have to do the right thing here, even though it means we're going to pay a price, etc. You're immediately firing them. In fact, it's firing so much that people silence it.
But that's not what I'm saying. Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying, because I'm actually saying reset the whole, reset the normal curve itself. In other words, it's not more curves to the right thing, it's more curves to the wrong thing, but the whole class is about, you use groupthink and you reverse it, and it's all about doing wrong things. In other words, it's versus what do you do here? Everyone's waiting for the right thing to do, right? So I'm reversing all, I think you reverse the knowledge landscape, because that's actually, you can teach a class about the internal dialogues, not the rational processes. And so that becomes normal. So what becomes normal is the illusions of thinking, the threats that we actually withhold, the internal dialogue that we censor, all the filters, and then you normalize, and they fall into it. Now the amygdala is not firing because everybody's doing it. So you reverse the whole, everybody's doing it. But and that's how you show the learning.
Take a facile instructor to do that, though.
It's theoretically, yeah, correct.
Over there, maybe last comment. Shall we stay on time?
Maybe just an observation. We talked earlier about generational changes going on in the world and in the workforce, and I think that may speak to a very hopeful future in this area, because if you take a look at millennials and you look, they are changing the world, they are changing our companies, X, Y. I mean, and they're different, and you can't ignore some of those things. But if you take a look at some of the things that are important to them, they're rooted in things that they believe to be right. Like going green and taking care of the world and service and things like that. Maybe more so than in prior generations or decades. And so, I think one of the things that may be useful to explore as ethics goes on is not just to look at ethics as ethics in a vacuum, but instead try to link it to some of these things, just like we try to incorporate it at Notre Dame into regular coursework, but maybe there's ways to link it to being green and link it to some of the other things of service and even in coursework, rather than have it be an ethics course on its own, maybe it's ethics tied to things that are like personal leadership and things that are important to this generation, because I think more and more, I think they get it maybe more than my generation did in some respects, and if we can hook into that and then ride that forward, that might be a way to move the ball on this thing more than we have in the past.
The elevation point.
Yes.
Elevate things. Jessica teaches a lot of our undergrads.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. One of the really exciting things I got the fortune to work with Mary on was a response to the development of a manual for managers around this HR issue with millennials. And what we did in the chapter was talk about capitalizing on these tendencies that millennials are exhibiting, which tend to, kind of prompt groans and what do we do with these, crazy entitled young people? When instead we can flip the frame and think about, here are people who are really passionate about wanting to bring their whole selves to work, right? So how do we use that momentum that they have in a way to transform our organizations? And so I'll put a plug in for the book. When we titled the chapter, Giving Voice to Values in Managing Multi-Generational Cultures, because I think that that's a really effective and actionable way of viewing this dilemma. So.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the participation. Thank you.
So if you hear a loud, like, it's me. And, it's sort of like, taught a course, I've edited a journal, I've run an MBA program, but I've never planned a conference. So this was one of those things, can we do it? I'm delighted. I feel very good about this as a first event for the center, and I hope that this isn't the best one. But I'm quite pleased with the way it worked. You are, each of you, I can't thank you enough for being here, for the contributions that you've all made to making today work very, very well. You should consider all of you, you're all in our network whether you like it or not. So we're going to be in touch with you. One of the things that's going to make this center work is the formation of a network and the sharing of thoughts and putting together, looking at what we might could do and putting together those things and making them happen and so forth. So I couldn't be happier with the day, and I thank you all again very much and wish you all safe travels, and God bless you.